perhaps you joined us yesterday. Welcome back. Yesterday, we discussed the theme of approaches to assessing and measuring inclusive rights-focused judicial programming. And just as last year and yesterday, we're pleased to have distinguished presenters with us today who, like all of you, are working to address timely and critical issues in the area of justice sector measurement. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping announcements. As you know, the session is being recorded. Also, we will work to put in the chat box the agenda and the biographies of our presenters so that you can have more background on their experience and expertise. We invite everyone to introduce yourselves in the chat box so we know who's part of the discussion and we can follow up with you after the event. If you please do that. Questions and comments are most welcome. This is, after all, the Justice Sector Measurement Talks, so we look forward to discussions and talking. Please put your questions and comments in the chat box. And then finally, we will have a Mentimeter survey at the end of the session. Really important for us to have your critical feedback, as that is helping us with our monitoring, evaluation, and measurement of this program. Finally, if you're not a member of the Knowledge Portal already, we invite you to be a member. We'll also put that that link in the chat box, and that's where we encourage everyone to continue the discussions from today on the discussion boards on the Knowledge Portal going forward. So without further ado, I'm really pleased to let you know that we have two great moderators this morning for our discussions. First, Schuyler Miller, who is a policy advisor at the U.S. State Department's coordinator for global anti-corruption, and then our colleague Lamarck Campbell, who is ABA ROLI's senior anti-corruption technical advisor. They will be moderating today's discussions on the theme of stock taking and good practices in assessing and measuring corruption and anti-corruption initiatives. Again, with my apologies for the delay, my apologies to the presenters. Over to you, Lamarck, to start today's talks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Margaret, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone who may be joining us at different time zones. Welcome to today's event, and as Mary Margaret mentioned, today we will be discussing stock taking and good practices in assessing and measuring corruption and anti-corruption initiatives. For today's event, we have three speakers. So we will have two snapshot presentations and followed by a deep dive presentation. And to start us off with some opening remarks, I will now pass it on to my fellow co-moderator, Sky Miller.
Thanks so much, Lamarck. I hope everyone can hear me okay. And hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to join everyone today to moderate today's session on stock taking and good practices in assessing and measuring corruption and anti-corruption initiatives. As Lamarck said, my name is Schuyler Miller, and I serve as a policy advisor for the State Department's coordinator on global anti-corruption, Richard Nephew. Secretary of State Blinken created the coordinator position last December to integrate and elevate anti-corruption across all aspects of U.S. diplomacy and foreign assistance. Our team is responsible for leading department implementation of the U.S. strategy on countering corruption. We'll also provide strategic thinking, facilitate cross-department efforts, and amplify U.S. and partner engagement on this very important issue. As a part of these initiatives, the coordinator and our team will work with colleagues across the Department of State and the interagency and partners in civil society and the non-governmental space to improve analysis and learning for our anti-corruption efforts. This includes leveraging existing metrics on corruption and anti-corruption and identifying new data and learning we need to collect. Through JustTrack and other Bureau initiatives, the department is striving to live up to the U.S. strategy on countering corruption's commitment to enhance corruption-related research, data collection, and analysis, and incorporate it into decision-making. I firmly believe that today's topic is one of the few keys to moving the needle forward on this issue. Despite clear challenges, if we can learn to harness tools to analyze corruption and our initiatives to address it, and then prioritize the application of this learning, which is really a sort of really important next step, we will make small or even large steps towards our anti-corruption goals. So today we're here to learn about some good practices in this area and think through how we can apply them in our own work. During this session, we'll have 2 snapshot presentations to showcase how we can measure corruption and efforts to counter corruption. One presentation will focus on measuring transnational corruption, and the other on using the UN Convention Against Corruption's review mechanism to assess anti-corruption efforts at the country level. We'll then have a dive-in presentation on the way that gender experiences interact with corruption, how corruption impacts gender inequality, and ways to measure these dynamics in programming. For each presentation, you can find more biographical information in the event invite materials we've circulated. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Lamarck to moderate our first presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Skylar. For our first presentation, I would like to introduce Roberto Martinez Kukuchka. He is the research expert on corruption measurement tools at Transparency International Secretariat, and he will be presenting on measuring transnational corruption. And thank you once again, Roberto, and over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone over there. Greetings from Berlin. I hope you can all see and hear me well. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm really delighted to be able to speak to all of you about this really challenging issue, which is measuring transnational corruption. I think 15 years of my career have been devoted to measuring corruption, and that's challenging enough. But bringing it up to measuring transnational corruption brings additional challenges, which I want to discuss in this meeting, and I hope we can extract some lessons from there. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So the first thing that I want to discuss is where do we stand, and what do we think about when we think about transnational corruption? What are the measurements that come to mind? There are several indicators, for example, of illicit financial flows. There are several indicators, economic indicators of illicit financial flows based, for example, on trade misinvoicing or other sort of projections. We have obviously the AML, the Basel Governance Institute AML index. So we have many aggregate measurements like this. At the same time, if we move on to the next slide, please, there's also growing criticism to the anti-money laundering agenda and to the issue of transnational corruption. So it seemed like we are dedicating a lot of resources to maybe controlling AML, to preventing money laundering, but at the same time, not a lot seems to be happening. So it's even at this point that outlets like The Economist or Forbes are calling for the case against anti-money laundering or the case against this fight against transnational corruption. And I believe that for us to be able to make a strong case and strong policies against these type of issues, we really need to go back to the drawing boards and start rethinking a little bit how we measure this, because without solid measurements, which at the moment we do not really have, it is very difficult to move forward and to provide the evidence base that we need for some of the policies targeted at transnational corruption. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So now, what are the challenges that we faced? As I said at the beginning, measuring corruption is challenging enough, and I'm sure we will have more opportunity to discuss this. But when we add the transnational component to the mix, this gets even more complicated. So next slide, please. So from my point of view, the 3 main issues that we face when looking at transnational corruption are certain conceptual ambiguities. So transnational corruption is, as corruption itself, an umbrella term that encompasses several phenomena and that needs really to be deconstructed. So I'm sure Matthias will be talking about this later and hearing from what he'll be focusing on. I think one way in which we have managed to successfully measure corruption is by disaggregating that umbrella term into its smaller components. So at Transparency International, for example, we have the Global Corruption Barometer, which checks what is the state of bribery or the use of connections and many other types of corruption that we see at the national level. And we have the Corruption Perceptions Index, which is a more macro measure. But I think we have managed in the past 25 years to sort of get the concepts right. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done in the area of transnational corruption to clarify some of the concepts. The second point is that we have an issue with missing data, but also with data overload. So we don't have enough of the data that we need, and we may be having too much of data that doesn't really tell us much. I will say a little bit more about this later. And finally, I think particularly on the issue of measuring transnational corruption, one of the problems is also that we have very limited systematic research, which makes measurement at the global level, so to speak, very difficult. So we cannot do the exact same type of analysis or similar type of analysis as the one that we do with corruption to identify some of the main drivers and consequences. And a lot of the work that we have here is very qualitative in nature, which is obviously not bad in itself, but really holds back the measurement front, so to speak. Next slide, please. So now focusing on the conceptual ambiguities, what do I mean with this? Next one, please. So the issue, I think, when we're looking at transnational corruption is that many concepts come to mind, including the issue of illicit financial flows. And here, I think there is an issue with, the concept itself is very, very complex, covers a lot of ground, and it's often mixed not only with corruption, as we see here in this graph produced by UNODC and UNCTAD, where they try to give us a framework on how to measure illicit financial flows. We see that the problem here is that there is an issue with, we're not only dealing with legal, but also with illegal activities. And on the side of illegal activities, corruption at the national level is only a bit of what we look at. The rest is illegal markets. There's also a lot of crime involved in how IFFs come to be. And then, of course, when we're trying to measure things that are hidden, such as crime, such as illegal markets and corruption, and then on top of that, try to add a transnational component, it makes it even harder to measure than when we're just looking at corruption from the national point of view. And then we can move on, please, to the next slide. If on top of this, we add the issue of money laundering, or how the money goes from, let's say, being dirty money to clean money, we see that we focus a lot on the process. And we have spent a lot of time trying to find what are the mechanisms of money laundering, how we go from placement, layering, integration into the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But given the lack of information that we have here, this framework of focusing on the process is not really one that allows us to translate that into actionable measurements. So the next slide, please. So that's on the side of the conceptual issues that I believe still need to be resolved. On data limitations, next slide, please. We have also documented at Transparency International what are the types of data that are missing. And one of the things that we know is that it is very important to know who is behind certain companies. It is very important to be able to triangulate government data with the other side of the coin, which is private property or ownership data. This is something that we have seen now recently as well with the seizure of assets from Russian oligarchs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's made much more difficult when we do not have beneficial ownership information. And the challenge here is that even if we focus on the European Union, which is one of the regions in the world where we have the best resource governments and governments with the most enforcement capacity, we see that many of them are really lagging behind in terms of the data that they offer, how the data is accessible, and whether it is freely accessible and in open data format or not. So this is one of the huge areas where we do need more work before we can actually start understanding transnational corruption a bit better and making the linkages between one country and the other. And the next slide, please. And the other thing that we see is that secrecy laws or financial secrecy is still an issue, and not only, as we often read in the media, in the countries in the West. So this is also an issue in developing countries where the illicit financial flows are seen as coming from. So this is just a scatter plot between the Corruption Perceptions Index, Transparency International's annual measurement of corruption, and the Tax Justice Network's Financial Secrecy Index. And as we see here, the correlation between what we have here is just very flat. So meaning it doesn't really matter where you stand on the CPI, you still have very different levels of financial secrecy. So this is another thing that I think needs to be tackled in the coming years. So improving minimizing financial secrecy across the board. So not only in the West and OECD countries, but also in developing countries. Next slide, please. And at the same time, what I meant with data overload is that because of how the anti-money laundering industry is set up and how the requirements are set up, the number of suspicious transaction reports has exploded in the past few years. And even the best resources, financial intelligence units, are having trouble keeping up with these reports. So it is easier now, so to speak, to say or flag transaction as suspicious just to prevent any sort of consequences in case we didn't flag it, right? So what we saw in one of the reports that we published earlier this year is that in the United States, for example, for every staff member at the FIU, there are 10,000 reports of suspicious transactions. So if this keeps going at that rate, there's really not much that we will be able to do to tackle transnational corruption. So it is really important, I think, to go to start looking for data that we can use to better trace what the impact is on our efforts for anti-money laundering and fighting transnational corruption. And the next slide, please. And now I also think there is very limited research, as I was saying before, in terms of, or very limited quantitative research in this area. So we can move to the next slide, please. So a lot of the information that we have on transnational corruption actually comes from data leaks. And most of these leaks are very important to help us paint a picture of how this works, but do not offer a full picture of the universe of financial transaction. And as a consequence, the results cannot really be generalized, the underlying mechanisms cannot really be identified, and the policy effectiveness cannot really be evaluated just based on the data that we have from such leaks. So this also makes it difficult to use the mechanisms and the information that we get from here to inform more widespread policies, so to speak. And I think this is a challenge that we still have to fix. So the next slide, please, in terms of what we're doing to measure transnational corruption here at Transparency International. We can move on to the next slide. First of all, we have been publishing for a few years now our report Exporting Corruption, which focuses on international bribery and the implementation of the OECD Convention against corruption and against bribery, sorry. There in this edition, which we just published yesterday, I believe, or on Tuesday, we have analyzed 47 countries, which cover 84% of global exports. And what we have seen is that out of these 47 countries, 20 have very little or no enforcement of this convention. 18 have limited enforcement. And then 7 have a very moderate one, and only 2 countries have active enforcement of this legislation. So what we see here, what we try to do here is break down the issue of transnational corruption into something that is measurable and much narrower, in this case, international bribery. Next slide, please. The second part is that we are also advocating for better data. So what we're trying to do, as I said before, one of the problems is we do not really have enough data, and at the same time we have too much of it. So what we're trying to do at Transparency International is advocating for better, more accessible data sets on beneficial ownership, on public procurement, on many other data sets that will be useful to trace and identify what are the patterns of transnational corruption. So this is also a report that we just published earlier this year on the, where we just analyze how well-resourced financial intelligence units are, for example, and how accessible the data on beneficial ownership and other types of data that we need for this is. And finally, the next slide, please. The other thing that we're trying to do is also highlighting the domestic drivers of transnational corruption. This is very important because I think sometimes when we talk about illicit financial flows or anti-money laundering, we tend to forget that this does not happen in the vacuum, or that this does not only happen in the countries where the funds or the illicit funds end up. I think if you even look at the Basel Governance Institute's AML index, you'll see that 65% of the score is composed of things that can be altered at the national level. So there really is a lot of homework to be done in the countries of the CPI, so to speak, or that the Corruption Perceptions Index marks as highly corrupt, such as that basically everything that is marked in red on this map. So this is why we're also trying to use the visibility that the Corruption Perceptions Index gets every year to also draw attention to the issue of transnational corruption by showcasing in our report on trouble at the top, which is something that we publish every year with the CPI, what is happening in the countries that end up being the, so to speak, the countries where the illicit financial flows end up arriving. So the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So without forgetting, obviously, that the roots of many of these funds are corruption at the national level. So that's it from my side. I hope I was on time. I apologize if I wasn't, but yeah, on that, back to Lamarck.
Thank you so much for that insightful presentation, Roberto. If there are any questions from the audience, please feel free to ask them in the chat, and I will address them and have Roberto address them. Well, I guess I'll start off with a question, Roberto. Thank you again. Wanted to find out, why has there been such little progress in measuring transnational corruption, and what is needed to speed up the progress?
Well, yeah, like I said, I think the difficulty of, like the conceptual difficulty of the issue is something that we have not managed to totally pin down. So that is number one. Then the second one is how difficult it is to get this data. So I think one of the issues that we face is the lack of collaboration and cooperation between different governments as well when it comes to the type of data that we require to measure this type of corruption. So I showed the map of beneficial ownership, for example, and that only shows whether this data is, well, A, exists, B, is accessible, and C, is in open data format, but it does not really show whether the data is comparable between country A and country B, right? Sometimes what you have when you look at these data sets is that all of them contain somewhat different information or reported in a somewhat different way. So I think the lack of standardization in this area is something that is really holding us back. And of course, since the measurement of transnational corruption is not only something that we can do by looking at government data, right? You might need to look also at the private sector side of things. There are also privacy laws that prevent us from doing that. So I think all of these laws that on, for example, freedom of access to information, right? Like the access to information laws that were passed in the late 90s or early 2000s, really allowed us, as like people like me measuring corruption at the national level, really allowed us to get a good look at what's going on under the hood. So having, of the government, so to speak. So having access to the budget, how all of this is spent, having access to how decisions are made, et cetera, was hugely important to find ways to measure corruption better, and not only at the national level, but also at the subnational level. And when it comes to transnational corruption, a lot of that work is still to be done. A lot of standardization of the data still needs to be done. And it might sound like something very technical and boring, which it is, but it's also hugely important.
All right, thank you so much for that, Roberto, and for addressing the question. I'll now turn it to our next speaker, who is Matthias Hutter. He's the Managing Director of the UNCAC Coalition, and he will present on assessing anti-corruption efforts at the country level.
Thank you very much, Lemark. Warm welcome from Vienna. Hi, everybody. Thank you to all the colleagues at ABA ROLI for putting this interesting session together. So I will talk to you about not so much measuring corruption, but looking at the anti-corruption measures on the national level and what we can find out about them. And I will focus on the UN Convention Against Corruption and its review mechanism and what we can, or what actors like you can get in terms of assessments and information from that process, but also what the limitations to these processes are. Next slide, please. So I will briefly talk about who we are as the UNCAC coalition. I will briefly introduce the UN Convention Against Corruption and its review mechanism. And then I will show you some tools that we're using to open up the review mechanism and make sure that non-governmental stakeholders are able to contribute, participate, and use it. Next slide, please. So the UNCAC Coalition, we are an umbrella organization of about 350 non-governmental organizations from around the world. We're based in Vienna, where the Secretariat of the UNCAC, of the UN Convention Against Corruption, is based. It is our mission to advance the monitoring and implementation of the UNCAC, and we coordinate advocacy efforts among civil society to advance the anti-corruption agenda on the global level, on the UN level, to push for the scaling of good practice approaches, and to make sure that the voices of civil society can be heard and are present in UNCAC fora. And our work is funded by Norway, Denmark, and the Secret Rousing Trust from the United Kingdom at this point. Next slide, please. So why am I telling you about the UNCAC? The UNCAC is the only binding, comprehensive, and global anti-corruption convention. We have a number of other anti-corruption conventions that either focus on specific issues. We have standards that are being reviewed, such as FATF or the regional anti-corruption conventions, but the UNCAC is the only convention that has a truly global scope, and it covers a broad range of anti-corruption issues. It covers the prevention of corruption, criminalization, international cooperation, asset recovery, and also technical assistance. One important aspect is that the UNCAC is shaped by the so-called Vienna spirit of consensus. So all the decisions made under the UNCAC are done by consensus. That means that the UNCAC represents the lowest common denominator that all countries can agree to. And that also affects, for example, the review mechanism and civic space around the convention. But what is important to mention, it's not on my slide here, but there is, so to say, a more updated document that represents the latest common consensus on global anti-corruption efforts, and that is the political declaration that the UN General Assembly adopted last year in a special session at the so-called UNGAS against corruption. So there's this political declaration, and recently states have started to do some voluntary follow-up reporting on what they have been doing to implement that political declaration. And I will share the links afterwards in the chat, so you could look at what is available in regards to that. Next slide, please. So a convention is just as useful as its review mechanism, because we really need a mechanism to hold governments to account to what they do to implement the standards and commitments they have agreed to. And so we have the UNCAC review mechanism. It's currently in its second cycle, which reviews countries on what they are doing to implement prevention and asset recovery provisions of the convention. It's a peer review mechanism, so two countries are doing a review of another country that is being under review. The focus of the reports is very much on the legal framework. In some of the reviews, you have information on actual implementation, on enforcement, but there's really a broad variety of how much evidence, how many data points do we have in these review reports. But they're really quite useful in terms of giving you a comprehensive analysis of the legal and policy frameworks that have been put in place. As I hinted, the level of transparency and inclusiveness is really much to be desired for, because it is up to the country under review to determine how transparent and inclusive that review should be. And so that there are two key documents that are being produced, or three key documents that are being produced for each review. It's a self-assessment where the country says what they have done to implement the convention. There's the full country report that is at the very end, the final product, and then there's an executive summary of about 10 pages that is produced. However, this executive summary is the only document that has to be published. The other two documents, which are much more useful and contain lots of insights, are really up to the government, to the state under review if they want to release it or not. Similarly, it's up to the country under review to decide, do they involve civil society and other non-governmental experts in the review process, and if so, how? That is really at the discretion of that government under review. But we, from our experience, we really see it's crucial to involve a broad range of experts to make sure that reviews are meaningful, are of high quality, and reflect not just the view of the government, but what is really the reality on the ground. Next slide, please. So I will present you a few tools we have been using to trying to open up this process. So we have the so-called transparency pledge. These are 6 principles that governments voluntarily commit to ensure a truly inclusive and transparent review process. So far we have we have 33 governments that have signed up to these higher standards, including the United States. The United States is very vocal about its signature. It highlights it in different UNCAC meetings, which we appreciate. And part of this commitment is to publish, for example, an updated time schedule of the reviews, the focal points, so who is the contact in the government, who coordinates that, but also the key documents, and to ensure that there's a public debate once the review is concluded about next steps and the findings of the review. We've also developed a guide to transparency and participation in the implementation review mechanism. So this is a short document that gives the governments ideas on how they can actually ensure an adequate level of transparency and inclusiveness throughout the process. Next slide, please. Another tool we have been using is we have developed a so-called UNCAC review status tracker. So we're trying to crowdsource from different governments, from the UN, from other sources, information on where each country is in their review process, because there have been long delays in the reviews. It's often not clear if a review has been conducted, if it's stuck in process, who is the contact point to reach out to, what documents are available. So we're trying to put all of that together, including to lower the entry points, lower the burden for civil society to be able to participate and contribute. Next slide, please. Another tool, because governments are at discretion to keep the key documents secret, also who has been involved is often not clear. What we have been doing over the past year is coordinate a campaign where NGOs use access to information legislation to request the release of the UNCAC review documents from countries. So far, we have filed these requests in about 30 countries, but more and more are filed over time. And from 11 countries, we already have documents published that were previously kept secret. We have a number of appeals ongoing, so we hope that over time, we free more and more of these self-assessments and full country reports. And it's really important for us that these documents become public in a timely manner, because if there's a delay of several years, the assessments are outdated and no longer so useful for evidence-based advocacy. But this is really has been quite an effective approach to get governments to release these documents. Often they're withheld, not because of bad intentions, but because nobody actually thinks of putting them into the public domain. Next slide, please. But the most important tool that we have been seeing is to actually involve civil society in the review process. And how we do that is by providing technical and some financial support to NGOs who want to do their own parallel report, their own parallel assessment of how the UNCAC is being implemented on the national level. And there we don't focus so much on the legal framework, but we really try to collect evidence. What is being done in practice? What is the evidence of implementation and enforcement? What data is available? What can we say about the situation on the ground and not just in law? These reports also develop very clear priority actions. They identify good practices that can be scaled in neighboring countries or globally. And these reports really act as a door opener for new engagement between civil society and the government. For example, when civil society interviews government experts or when they submit a draft for comments to anti-corruption bodies, this is often the beginning of a new relationship, of a conversation about policies and about reform needs. And these reports really provide an evidence base for donors, for development partners, and for civil society in the country to showcase what are good practices, but also to highlight what are the most urgent reform needs. Where is the country lacking behind on global best practice, such as beneficial ownership transparency, one issue that Roberto mentioned as a really important area where we need to see reforms in more and more countries. Next slide, please. And so far, over the past 2 years, we have supported more than 25 of these parallel reports already, including in countries where civil society is often not that strong. But with the guidance, with the templates, with the support we're providing, we're getting good quality analysis, and this also really helps to build the capacity and expertise of these civil society groups on a range of anti-corruption issues. So if you're working on those countries, I would invite you to look at these parallel reports. They might contain some really interesting insights that could be beneficial for your work. Next slide, please. And finally, some of the conclusions or some of our lessons that we have learned is that governments really need reminders and some nudging to create inclusive and transparent review processes. That applies to the UNCAC, but I'm sure it applies to many other reviews and bodies. So if you are in a position where you're working with government partners in other countries, often it's really helpful to remind them to ensure that there's a need to bring in civil society, to bring in other non-governmental experts into a process, or if you're a reviewer, for example, to suggest that, because often the experts who are coordinating these processes, they need some nudging. We also see that civil society can really add a lot in terms of raising the quality and the insights of these official reviews. For example, when they are then submitting their own parallel reports to the official reviewers or have separate meetings with the reviewers, that can really help highlight what are the key questions that the official review should address and focus on. And as I already mentioned, these review processes, these are really often an opportunity to build new relations between civil society and governments, to build trust, to work together on a very technical level, on policy questions. That can be some kind of a door opener for collaborative efforts to advance some reforms. And the reviews are an opportunity to raise the reform needs or to highlight reform needs and to maybe build some momentum to move forward. So be really happy to answer any questions you may have or dive a bit deeper onto specific issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthias. Yes, so I think we have a first question from participants, and the first question is, when it mentions civil society, are we talking about the general population NGOs and or private sector. You can collaborate on, I guess, civil society in this UNCAC review mechanism.
Primarily, we're talking about NGOs, so organized civil society that has specific areas of expertise, and to some extent also about academia. So these are the groups that we represent as the UNCAC coalition. We do not work very closely with the private sector or with interest groups, lawyers, judges, accountants, and so on, because these stakeholder groups usually have their own fairly effective lobbies and ways to get into these processes, and have less challenges to become involved than independent NGOs. So that's when I say civil society, it's usually NGOs and academia.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Matthias. I guess a follow-on question with that, when we're talking about civil society, if you could elaborate more on examples of how civil society organizations are brought into the National UNCAC review process and also follow-up discussions.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So there's really a broad range of ways how you can ensure an inclusive process during the reviews, but also afterwards. So we have seen, for example, that a number of states, when they do their self-assessment, they share a draft with civil society and allow them to contribute and add comments, which really helps provide a more comprehensive assessment of what has been done in terms of the legal framework and policy framework on the national level. Another way many countries involve civil society groups is so during the official review process, there is a country visit. The two reviewing countries come and speak with the government representatives under review. And the best practice is to organize a separate meeting with civil society. The very best practice is to do that in advance of the meetings with the government, so that civil society can already raise important issues beforehand. That has been done in many countries in Latin America, and we also saw that many of the groups that did these parallel reports and built already a relationship with the government were then brought into these meetings with the visiting experts, for example, in Paraguay, in Chile, in Colombia, in Brazil. We also saw that in Papua New Guinea, the NGO was involved in all the meetings with the reviewers and the government, and then was even invited to be part of the government delegation that traveled to Vienna and participated in the UNCAC, the IRG, which is the group, the governmental group that discusses the review process and the reviews, which is usually close to civil society. But in that case, civil society was brought in by the government. And we've also seen in a number of countries that after the review is concluded, the government forms a follow-up process or body. For example, in Bosnia, the government recently formed a working group that included civil society to discuss next steps in the reform process. So there's a lot of creative, easy ways how government and civil society can collaborate on moving reform ideas forward.
All right, thank you, Matthias. And I think we have a question from JJ Welling. I think she's referring to the slide in which you highlighted the number of civil society organizations that submitted parallel reports. She's asking what was the recommendations you made for folks working with those countries? So for folks working with or in those countries, I would encourage you to look at these parallel reports. They're on our website. Usually the groups try to share them with the local stakeholders in country, but if they haven't reached you, please take a look at them. They really highlight what are good practices in the country, but also what are the reform needs and what are the specific reforms the civil society experts identify as top priority or most impactful. And these can be useful
useful talking points when talking to local partners, or when you do new programming in regards to technical assistance needs. That may be a useful guidance document to understand what are the needs identified by local civil society, because the official UNCAC reviews that are coming out are consensus documents. So that means they're really the product of a negotiation between the reviewing countries and the country under review. So in some cases, they are very timid, they are not very critical, and they often don't really put the finger where the wound is. So they really reflect often parallel realities, where the legal framework in a highly authoritarian country may be perfect, but the reality on the ground is very different. So the civil society reports we're putting out there are trying to balance that and provide a more comprehensive picture.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matthias. We have one final question from INL Bosnia. You mentioned that the government is forming a working group in Bosnia. Could you please provide a bit more information on this?
Yeah, I would have to get back to the colleagues separately. If you could share your email, then we would be happy to get back to you offline.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Matthias, for this presentation on the UNCAC review mechanism and CSO involvement in the process. Thank you so much. And now we'll turn it over to my co-moderators, Skylar Miller, to introduce the next presenter.
Thanks so much, Lamarck. Next, we're going to move to a dive-in session on gender and corruption. Over the last several years, governments and NGO stakeholders have highlighted the way that gender affects experiences with corruption and the impact of corruption on gender inequality. To explore this further, we'll hear from Christy Kelly, Associate Professor at Drexel University and Columbia University. And after her presentation, we very much look forward to your questions. Christy, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Skylar. And thank you to the Just Track team for the invitation to share some of my work today on the topic corruption, what's gender got to do with it. So I really appreciate the two introductory pieces today, because we get a sense of transnational, national, the way civil society is brought in, the difficulty of measuring corruption as a whole. And so my hope today is to give a deep dive into some of the complexity of gender and the experiences that women in particular in local contexts have managing corruption, negotiating with corruption, negotiating out of corruption on behalf of their families, to again reveal a little bit of the work that's left to be done. And then I hope really that we can have a conversation on your experiences on the field and what we can learn from them as well to do our work better. So today I'm going to take us on a little journey from Africa to Asia and back to the US to see how we can analyze some of the mainstream concepts that structure what we see as the gender equality and corruption problem, and how solutions are imagined and the challenges of measuring change. So my involvement in bringing a gender lens to anti-corruption work actually began in 2014 with an invitation from Transparency International to lead a student team to look at the experiences of women in a couple of countries in Africa. And their concern was that they had resource centers on the ground in which people could report corruption, particularly in land grant access, and that women weren't showing up and reporting corruption. So the concern was, what was going on? Were women not able to access these centers? Did they not understand what corruption was? Did they not have the resources? And so my team spent weeks in the field interviewing women. And what we learned surprised us. It was that women were showing up at centers to report, but what they thought was corruption was not seen as such when they went in to report it. They were turned away and told their experiences were just mundane stories of greasing the wheels of business. Their experiences of petty bribes were ignored. What we learned is that corruption had been defined based on men's experiences, and so were the anti-corruption messages, interventions, as well as monitoring and evaluation. Next slide. So today I'm going to focus a little bit on petty corruption, because women are most likely to experience this form of corruption in their interactions as they try to access basic goods or services in places like hospitals, schools, police departments, land grant agencies, judicial spaces. And it's most likely to increase poverty and inequality for women and their families. It's rarely captured in formal measures of corruption or in anti-corruption campaigns and reporting mechanisms on the ground. Interestingly, because women are also employed at the level of petty bureaucrats, that is most often where women themselves are engaged as active agents in institutionalizing corruption into feminized fields such as education and healthcare. While the UN and international organizations have spent quite a bit of time trying to investigate the interactions between gender and corruption, there's actually little work in the scholarly research around these two spaces. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why that's important. Next slide. In my own literature review of the scholarly research around gender and corruption, I find that there's two main bodies of findings that have shaped the field in important ways. Most of the literature rests largely on political science from the global north, while some anthropology thrown in by post-colonial scholars in the global south. The first stream of literature shows a correlation between lower levels of gender equality and higher levels of corruption. The assumption is that corruption is the domain of men, with women serving as potential political cleaners who can be rallied to political and organizational leadership by men to fix corrupt institutional practices and clean up dirty network organizations. Policy and program interventions tend to focus on increasing women's participation in the public domain. This stream reproduces gender as a binary and women as a monolithic category. We'll return to this later. Next slide. The second stream addresses gaps in the first stream by focusing on within-country variation, with a particular focus on the ways that poverty and government shape regimes of corruption. Findings suggest there are similarities across institutions such as education, labor markets, that increase women's vulnerability as both direct and indirect victims of corruption. Policy and programmatic interventions then tend to focus on changing institutional and organizational practices that exacerbate women's intersectional vulnerabilities, usually again with the heavy burden on women doing the work of changing their own lives. Some of the research here suggests that men are more likely to be asked for bribes, while women are more likely to be asked for sexual favors. And intersectional analysis could benefit this stream as well. So I bring this up because the scholarly literature has actually shaped the field of assessment, leaving women and gender analysis largely out. We need to rethink how corruption is defined and by whom, and how it is studied, as well as interventions to prevent, negotiate, report, measure, and address corruption at the local level. Next slide. So let me introduce you to my friend and research collaborator, Zia. Zia is from an upland area of Vietnam, where I do most of my work. She's from an area called Sapa. She's from an ethnic minority group called the Hmong. There are 52 ethnic groups in Vietnam, and the majority are called King or Viet people. While many ethnic minority groups are integrated into mainstream society, many live more traditional lives in the rural uplands along China, Laos, and Cambodian borders. Zia's life is devoted to protecting herself and other women in her community from being trafficked and to maintaining her family's livelihood and independence. She married early to prevent being trafficked as part of Hmong bride capture traditions, which have been co-opted by Chinese and Ging organizations to lure women into sex work and transnational marriages. She's now involved in a variety of elaborate schemes to protect herself and her family from losing their land, keeping their children in school, getting access to and passing certification exams to keep their jobs, accessing healthcare, and maintaining their livelihoods in the context of COVID and climate disasters. Sometimes these schemes work to maximize their profits and can be seen as greasing the wheels of business to speed up the work of complicated bureaucracies or to hold petty bureaucrats accountable and responsible. Outside of such contexts, we can often think of these things as expediting fees, but when the cost is transparent and anyone with money can pay them. The goal is to advance to the head of the line or get better service. But when they're not transparent, when the costs are negotiated, or people don't have the resources to pay, or when refusing to pay means you're denied services, or they're denied, or they're unnecessarily delayed, this is putting into the bucket of petty corruption. So Zia regularly pays fees to assure that people do their job and treat her fairly. Figuring out what fees are required, how to pay them, when and to whom is the work that many in Zia's community called chasing shadows. It's mostly women's work and requires vast knowledge, social and political capital, and extended patronage networks. Sometimes sex is requested when money or social capital are not enough. Next slide. So you might be wondering, how prevalent is corruption in Asia and in Vietnam specifically? So here are some great data from some past Transparency International reports, but even the data here is hard to get, and Vietnam hasn't participated, I think, in some of the most recent reports. I'll be curious to hear if others have more interesting data. But 3 things to note. The highest rates of bribery reported is in public health and in public school. This belies the assumption that women are not involved, since most of the work of these 2 industries is done by women. And since teachers and nurses are the main people involved, they're also the recipients of bribes. In comparative studies of perceptions of citizens, most people believe that corrupt institutions are extractive industries, transportation, land management, all masculine and male domains, even though most people are likely to be involved in corruption at the local level in health and education. So why are rich people paying bribes but not the poorest? Upward mobility to get into better schools, better hospitals, better jobs. If you have money or strategic social networks, you can afford to advance yourself or your family members. If not, you risk dropping out or missing key opportunities for advancement. So this is what's happened to Zia. So we're going to take a deep dive into some of her choices and the opportunities available to her, and then look on the national to the global level, how this is impacting women's experiences with corruption. I tell her story to illustrate how slippery and pervasive the problems are and how difficult to study and measure. Next slide. So Zia lives along the China-Vietnam border. There's a very active trade route for goods. This is the picture. China is on one side, Vietnam on the other. And it's a formal trade route, but the borders are quite porous. And so those with fewer resources rely on informal trade routes to avoid paying high fees or delays en route, both of which can be negotiated through bribes. Most of the informal traders using these routes are women. While Zia's family is not directly involved in cross-border trade, living near a border presents opportunities and risks for everyone, not just those directly involved. Next. Next slide, thank you. This area is a key tourist destination for in-country travel and for international tourists. The area that she lives in is terraced rice farming that goes back generations. It's designated a cultural heritage site by the central government, and they restrict development and allow for maintenance of cultural traditions. It had a booming tourist industry until COVID shut it down, and it's beginning to slowly reopen this summer. Next slide. So 20 years ago, when Zia was in primary school, the area was largely inaccessible. There were a few backpackers and a couple expats who would travel in, and Zia would skip school, and she would try to sell small handicrafts and learn foreign languages from the backpackers coming through. With the increasing number of international organizations working in the region and a large number of companies beginning to open up, she actually quit school formally and started a co-op with other women to create a trekking industry. It's quite successful, and it's entirely women-run. So next slide. Their success and increasing global interest in the region did not go unnoticed by the central government or national tourism industry in the early 1990s and into the 2000s when I first started researching here. It took an overnight train and a 5-hour-long winding commute on the back of a motorbike, followed by a half-day trek through rice paddies to reach her village. It now takes about 4 or 5 hours from the Hanoi airport on a van. Next slide. Ecotourism is increasingly being replaced by 5-star resorts, spas, and cable cars, allowing wealthy tourists to skip the trekking and cultural exchanges and just jump right into the beautiful mountains. The 5-star resort industry caters to wealthier Asians and older and less experienced travelers, but join tours and are guided by Vietnamese guides, not the local indigenous women's groups. Next slide. So this is to say that with development come new rules and institutional practices which bifurcate the tourism industry, creating hard lines between them. The central government controls all access through gang managers now who migrate from peri-urban centers to escape their own urban marginality. Here they can make money quickly, their kids are perceived as hardworking, bright, even privileged compared to the now minoritized ethnic minority children, and they have power and autonomy over their lives, more so than before. For Zia and her family, there are now lots of fees to be paid and back kickbacks to pay back to the guides and the new tourist industries, the hotels, to be able to maintain their livelihood. She now has to take accreditation exams in the Vietnamese language to make sure that she passes and is able to be a tour guide. There are now fees to be paid to enter her village. And if she just pays a tiny piece of the fee to the local company, she could avoid paying the larger fees that are formal. So actually negotiation of bribes is a way of making more money personally for her. Next slide. So these rules and practices are being defined by the first in, and they tend to leave out women and ethnic minority communities in decision making. This leaves women like Zia and her family in an increasingly precarious position. Without paying these small bribes, she would not be able to maintain her livelihood. Her husband has been a longtime cook in one of the oldest hotels in Sapa, but even for him, life has become unsustainable and ripe with corruption. More fees paid out of his salary for the kinds of resources he used to have available meant that he ended up quitting his job and moving back home. And now he runs the food industry and a hotel, a local hostel, while Zia does trekking. Next slide. In 2019, they took out loans to build a traditional wooden log home, hoping to build a homestay together. But then COVID hit. COVID closed the tourism industry, both within Vietnam and internationally. With few options for making money, she and other women in her village turned to the skill they learned during childhood, embroidery. Hmong clothes are made by hand. They grow their own hemp, weaving it into thread and cloth, dyeing it with indigo from their gardens, and embroidering it by hand with designs going back generations. But who will buy the cloth? As a girl, she relied on tourists to buy her handicrafts, and as a trekking guide, she knew there was always ready markets and she could get products out to internationally. But now, during COVID, she explains she's stuck with limited access to internet. International payment schemes are charging her back kickbacks, and limited written English skills means she's stuck in trying to create websites to sell her goods. She relies on her many international friends and Facebook contacts to help her buy and sell. But each time she tries to sell something international, she has to pay a 20% commission to the local post office person to make sure it gets onto the international circuit. So anyway, she's luckier than most because she has these international connections. Her local networks are more fluid and unstable. Next. Her extended family has returned to farming. She and her husband help with the corn harvest, growing rice and tea, drying corn for the pigs, and picking oranges to sell to the market. But produce is often lost along the way as floods and overdevelopment are causing the roads to be washed out on a regular basis. Their loans have come due, and so they've resorted to selling precious land, probably falling victim to land grabs by officials who know their financial struggles and the value of their land. The picture at the bottom center here is one of the advertisements where she's showing a piece of the land and the view it has and trying to sell it to make ends meet. In addition to new rules impacting tourism, Zia's family also must contend with climate change and growing corruption impacting her community's ability to adapt. World Bank and ADB expect temperatures in Vietnam to rise by 1 to 3%, putting an additional 6 to 12 million people at risk of flooding. Economic losses caused by climate change could reach 15 billion by the middle of the century, with floods causing an additional 9 billion worth of damage. These numbers have ominous implications for Vietnam and have sparked protests and attention by local NGOs calling out the government on green corruption charges. But for minority communities at the forefront of climate crisis, they're catastrophic. Increasing development in Sapa, the new highways, bridges, airports, train routes, and rampant building of unsustainable hotels cut into the mountains has increased the risk of mudslides during floods. Next slide. So to safeguard her future, Zia is investing in her son's education, but even here she cannot escape the effects of fuzzy rules and regulations. She's moved her son to live with her parents so he can be registered in a better school district. She risks being caught and having to pay fees in order to make sure that she's in the right school district. He attends special summer and after-school programs to receive the tutoring he needs to compete with his Vietnamese peers. At home, they've given up their local language so he can concentrate on his Vietnamese. She's preparing for the extra cost of sending him to a boarding school, since at this point there are none in easy travel from home. But education policy guarantees ethnic minority students free access to boarding schools, but she's heard that the policy is not always implemented as designed. Envelopes paid years in advance can guarantee her son will not be left behind, even with good entrance exam scores. And she's just one piece of the larger system of corruption that structures education choice and opportunity. UNDP in 2010 and Transparency International in 2013 identified these ways on this slide that corruption is impacting education. It's worsening the quality and quantity of public services like healthcare. It diverts public resources into private pockets, and it reduces access to these services for families like Zia's, particularly when officials charge illicit fees to access the same services. Because women are most likely to negotiate education and healthcare on behalf of families, it's not surprising that women generally are more likely to report public sector as the most corrupt part of government, and why they're more likely to see corruption as a significant or worsening problem. Bauer and Charon, in a 2020 study of gender differences in perceptions of corruption, argue women tend to perceive a higher prevalence of need corruption, which is when people use corruption to access basic public services. And men, they argue, perceive a higher prevalence of greed corruption, which is when people resort to corruption to gain unfair privileges. And then there's a problem of employment once her son graduates from school. Many people are starting to drop out of high school because the cost of getting your first job is the equivalent of a year's salary. So they figure you might as well start working now. We'll never get the job we want anyway. So avoiding corruption is a gendered and racialized and geographic problem. But we can learn a lot through this as we see the bifurcation of the education system now on top of the tourism industry. Next slide. So there are many reasons given for why corruption is increasing in the education sector. Based on my own research started in 2018-19, through interviews with high school students and their parents, this is what we heard. There's weak institutional accountability with an asking-giving culture, a reciprocity culture, and poor management of regulatory agencies. Insufficient legal systems stifled by loopholes and contradictions, lack of whistleblowing culture in denouncing corruption in the education sector, poor pay for teachers, limited public participation in monitoring, supervision, and management of schools, lack of transparency in allocation and utilizations. In urban areas, young people perceive corruption as common practice. I found perceptions of corruption higher in urban areas and closest to government centers. Next slide. Students openly discuss corruption in school, and parents, mostly women, discuss taking time off work to navigate the complicated bureaucracies of entrance into competitive high schools and the university systems, or they outsource their labor to fee-for-service organizations in the increasing shadow education economy. Next slide. I've also heard stories of mothers taking a year leave from employment to navigate the high school and college entrance exam system for their children. I've heard stories of families going into debt to send their children abroad to study, where at least the tuition fees were transparent compared to the ever-fluid gift-giving and social networking they assumed were needed throughout college. There's a whole group of research about which countries are the most corrupt in terms of study abroad as well. So happy to share that research with you later. Next slide. Against this backdrop, the Vietnamese government has taken important steps to address governance and corruption challenges. And I think there's a lot, if for those of you working in the field, you know the amount of work that governments have done. The next slide. But there's one thing about corruption, it's that women are more likely to be harassed or not believe when they report corruption. Also, there's a sense that corruption is something out there and not something that women are likely to experience. This is supported by another gendered story, that of media coverage. A perusal of corruption cases that make headlines in the news tend to leave women's stories out. Top news stories over the past 5 years focus on corruption in securities exchange, a case of embezzlement at Petro Vietnam, the national oil industry, corruption in banking. If you're watching the news today on Vietnam, there's a dual COVID scandal that's going on that's making the news. This looks pretty gendered, huh? Let's go on to the next slide. Spaces and places and processes where corruption is addressed in Vietnam often leave women and ethnic minority communities out. They rarely get coverage, and certainly not in the context of anti-corruption. They get coverage on gender discrimination work. Images here represent the work of NGOs tackling human trafficking, forced marriages across the border. Images portray trafficked babies returned to their mothers, and trafficking survivors educating others near border markets. The headlines tell the story of women as victims, but they also show them as activists and advocates for change. Next slide. When women in corruption do hit the news cycle, stories tend to be of women leaders and activists. A Vietnamese court just last week sentenced, or actually a few weeks ago now, Nguyen Thi Khanh, an environmental leader prominently known for her role in campaigning for the reduction of coal-fired energy in Vietnam. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison on the charges of committing tax evasion, according to her NGO Green ID. Her arrest has sent chills through the environmental movement and follows the arrest of several other women NGO leaders on tax evasion charges. While acknowledging that tax evasion is definitely a problem, local women activists believe that these corruption charges are actually a strategy to silence them. Next slide. So while I've presented here one case so far, it's important in helping us see how corruption has been institutionalized into men's and women's everyday experiences in gendered ways. When informal networks can appear local and serve as more or less temporary solutions to problems of exchange and are left unsolved by the lack of rule of law and administrative reform, they risk becoming corruption. When they're left to evolve naturally, these informal networks risk becoming elaborate systems of neo-patrimonial exchange that are hard to change. In Zia's case, her need to pay small envelopes here and there to grease the wheels, to hold petty bureaucrats accountable to doing their job, or to just assure she maintains her livelihood, is situated within racialized, gendered, geographic regimes of power, amplified by global capital and international development. Of course, this isn't news to you. So the question now is what to do with this information and what resources are available to help us better address corruption through a gender analysis. Next slide. What we know is that when it comes to corruption, women are not absent, nor are they merely victims or political cleaners, as much as that existing literature that I mentioned earlier in the presentation would have us believe. By taking a step back and considering how corruption itself produces discourses, practices, and meanings that change over time and place, as well as to the user, we can make visible why what appears as corruption to some can appear to others as merely a matter of discrimination or gender inequality. Centering marginalized communities and diverse women's experiences within them is key to the process. And the good news is that the majority of people surveyed in a 2020 study of corruption actually believe that ordinary citizens can and should make a difference. And their first line of defense is education, sex disaggregated data collection, and gender analysis. Next slide. Unfortunately, we have siloed the gender equality work that's going on in development from the anti-corruption work that's going on in development, with a lot of gender specialists out there not recognizing the potential that they have to contribute to the anti-corruption work, with anti-corruption experts not necessarily reaching out to the gender specialists. So I think one of our strategies here is how to mainstream corruption analysis into gender equality work, but also how to mainstream gender analysis into anti-corruption work. And let me give you two very brief examples. I was in Da Nang in central Vietnam working with a group of international NGOs that had pooled resources together to hire drivers, as they didn't all need cars for their organizations. They were concerned that the NGOs only hired male drivers, and so they wanted a gender mainstreaming analysis of what was going on and an intervention to help understand that women could drive as well, and that in fact, if they hired women drivers, there'd be more gender equality in the space. What we actually learned was that, of course, they thought women were perfectly good drivers, but the men had been siphoning off petrol and pocketing the money on their own. They had a little corruption scheme going on. And so it wasn't that they were concerned that women couldn't drive. They were concerned that women were too clean and morally pure and wouldn't actually participate in the scheme, that they would call them out. So the gender discrimination was actually about corruption and not about the assumed stereotypes that women couldn't drive. A second case in Nigeria, there was a corporation that refused to hire men as accountants. And so we did a gender equality analysis to figure out what was going on. Did they think that men couldn't do accounting? No, in fact, men were very good accountants. But in this case in Nigeria, the assumption was that men have to always show a lot of money. They gain masculinity points in their community by having extra money. And so they were more likely to be perceived as scheming money from the company so that they could, be held up as better standards at home. So again, by not having taken corruption and gender into analysis in those two cases, we miss so much of the story. So in the second case, the solution for reducing corruption risk actually discriminated against men and reproduces the myth set up by the early political science literature. See, I said we'd come back to that again, that women are incorruptible or can serve as political cleaners. An intersectional feminist analysis allows us to see corruption as the result of patriarchal networking, patronage, and clientist behavior. It also allows us to examine gender inequality in relation to definitions of corruption and strategies to prevent it. Next slide. So UNODC and Transparency International offer really useful examples and strategies and cases through their research and their toolkits and their various reports that I think bring gender and anti-corruption better together. And so I've just pulled from some of those as what we can do moving forward. The recommendations include shift from a just add women and stir approach to bringing women into anti-corruption and actually mainstream gender analysis into all aspects of anti-corruption work. We need to understand women and men as both potential victims and perpetrators. We need to co-construct policies and programs with those most affected, and we need to include gender specialists on anti-corruption teams. I think what is really telling here is that perceptions of corruption hurt development, whether or not corruption is actually going on in the context. It's the perceptions that really we need to get behind and understand those as gendered. So next slide. Just to conclude, as Zia was able to weave together a livelihood that more than just farming, more than just handicrafts, trekking, mothering, homestay, entrepreneur, we also need to re-examine our own work in terms of bringing together an intersectional gender and feminist analysis to anti-corruption work in all its complexity. I have a set of resources I've pulled together as a starting point for people interested in learning more, as well as I recommend going to the UNODC checklist for mainstreaming gender in anti-corruption programs, which we're also going to make available. I've actually added a column in that work to make sure that we're also looking at the way we report our studies and our work, as opposed to just doing monitoring and evaluation. I think we don't report enough, and that also has a gender analysis. So I am going to close it out here, and we're really excited to be able to learn from all of you today and hear about cases and your experiences as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christy, for that really comprehensive and kind of multi-level presentation. Really appreciated how you kind of went through the global statistics and both kind of what we've studied historically and where we might need to go at the macro level, but then really kind of humanizing it and getting into Zia's story and the real kind of human costs. I'll kind of do a wrap up at the end, but I want to kind of give us space for a conversation. I know that you had some questions for the group to kind of kick things off. So I'll go ahead and raise one of those for folks who might want to chime in. And then if anyone either has a response to this question that we're going to pose to the group, or if you have a question for Christy, really want to kind of make the time that we have remaining a conversation as much as possible, we can go from there. So I'll just ask kind of in the vein of creating a spirit of conversation, if anyone on the line has kind of tools or resources that you use in your work on this issue of gender and corruption. And if you don't have kind of tools or resources, even just kind of your experiences dealing with this issue at a programmatic level, working with either in-country partners or at a macro level across countries. Curious for folks' input on that front, and if anyone doesn't have anything there, we can go to questions. So I'll just leave a little bit of space if anyone wants to jump in. Christy, it looks like we do have a question in the chat about the article on gender and need, greed, corruption. I think this is the one where it was talking about women tend to face need corruption versus men greed corruption.
Sure. I am just pulling up that link, and I'll put it in the chat as well. Thanks. Yeah.
We had 2 questions on that, so we're almost back to back.
I'm glad. That's good. We'll make sure that that's also in the resources. I think, I don't know if someone can point that out where that would be within the knowledge framework as well. I think we pulled together about 20 references, gender mainstreaming, UNODC, Transparency International documents, places where you can, really look at some of these tools and some of the literature around that.
Great. And then it looks like Roberto flagged that TI's Global Corruption Barometer has really looked at this issue, and I know TI, you've done a good amount of reporting on this issue and whatnot. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah. And I'd be curious to hear from Roberto sort of what's on the horizon, if you have a sense of what's to come that we could be looking at in terms of reports coming out soon.
Sure. Thank you so much, Christy, for the presentation. It was very, very interesting to hear and to see all of the work that you've been doing on the issue and how much it really aligns with what Transparency International has been, finding out through our research. I think, as I wrote in the chat, the Global Corruption Barometer is, at this point, the backbone of a lot of the gender work that we do, because it helps us document precisely what you did very well in this presentation, how women experience corruption differently, but also perceive it differently, and also allows us to flag what are some of the challenges that women find when not only when reporting corruption, but also in their everyday lives. So what we did with the latest round of the Global Corruption Barometer was to start experimenting, for example, with the issue of sextortion. So we included questions in the Global Corruption Barometer on the prevalence of sextortion, the perceived prevalence of sextortion, or whether people knew of someone or themselves who had been a victim of sextortion. It's a very tricky question to ask in a survey, and especially in more conservative societies, it's really difficult to talk about this issue. So we're still exploring our way around that one, but we have data on sextortion, which is not, as I said, it's not the perfect question to ask. It's not phrased in the best possible way. We're trying, but we have now comparable data for Asia, Latin America, Europe, and I believe also the Middle East. And what is on the horizon is I also linked another report. Unfortunately, the Global Corruption Barometer only allows us to analyze the results in the breakdown of men versus women, so to speak. So we still have this very binary understanding of gender, and we leave aside how, for example, the LGBTQ community might perceive corruption or might be more of a victim of corruption as well. So on that, we have, I linked a report in the chat as well, which we called Defying Exclusion. We published that last year. And in that one, we basically worked with a more qualitative methodologies. So through interviews and also with work with other organizations that have been working in that space for much longer than Transparency International has, to also document how other minorities experience corruption. So may it be racial ethnic minorities, or maybe indigenous people, or the LGBTQ community. So that is on the horizon. And at the moment, the last round of survey that we conducted was in the Pacific, so in the Pacific Islands, which was challenging because it was the very first time that we conducted a survey in such a challenging region. And we are conducting also the gender analysis of those results at the moment. And the results of that gender analysis will lead to also focus groups in the region to understand where the identified problems are coming from. So for example, in Latin America, we documented how many of the things that you said in your presentation, how women do not report corruption because they think they won't be taken seriously, or because they feel that they fear also that there will be negative consequences for doing so. So these are all things that we want to also understand further in the context of the Pacific, and that's what we'll be conducting focus groups on that. So yeah, stay tuned for those.
Thanks, Roberto. Any other questions or comments from the group? Or reactions? All right, no one's jumping in. So I will go ahead and just ask a question, kind of maybe to pull some of the threads together. Oh, we got a question from JJ, maybe. JJ, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sorry, Scott. Yes, one of the questions, or it seems like as we're beginning to better understand the linkages between gender and corruption and other types of marginalization and marginalized groups and corruption, what do you see as some of the implications for how we should be doing kind of foreign assistance program design, implementation and measurement differently?
I'm happy to jump in first. I think one of the areas that I'm seeing, I definitely am seeing USAID, right, picking up the sort of nexus between gender and anti-corruption work in really important, impressive ways. I think there was a 2 or 3 day forum earlier this fall. APEC last year actually ran a gender and anti-corruption, a set of conversations for the APEC region countries. Interestingly, their difficulty was just getting enough women to serve on panels, just getting enough women to show up. It wasn't that there was a feminist analysis or any changes. It was just, where are the women doing anti-corruption work? And I think it depends a lot on the context that we're in what needs to be done. So starting slowly and then moving into bigger areas. I worked this past year on some gender training that included anti-corruption, as well as anti-corruption that includes gender training. We've been analyzing where and how anyone could learn about the nexus if they didn't have access to, university libraries and resources or, development assistance. And one of the things we found is that there are plenty of free open access training programs that are asynchronous online to learn around gender equality. There are a few on anti-corruption work, but they don't intersect. There's the gender equality trainings and work don't ever imagine corruption as part of the inequalities that people are experiencing. And most of the anti-corruption training is male voiceovers, male cases, male in attendance. So just as a simple binary, we're seeing that there's not a lot of overlap in these spaces. So I think more focus on how to bring these two together so that both sides are learning and coordinating and developing these kinds of strategies that we actually need on the ground and developing those relationships. It's a learning process for everybody.
Looks like we've got a question from Tanyel. Hopefully I said that correctly.
You did. Thank you. Hi, Christy. Tanyel Taishi here, ROLI's Senior Gender and Inclusion Technical Advisor. Loved the presentation, and this is a
Tanya, I think we might have lost you.
Our gender and inclusion analysis approach. So let's talk later, okay?
Absolutely. Thanks. Yeah.
I'll jump in with a question. Like I was mentioning earlier, one thing I like to do in pretty much any conversation is think about sort of the devil's advocate opposition argument, right? Why, kind of helps us to kind of think through how to make the argument to folks who might be more skeptical, right? So just thinking for someone, talking to an anti-corruption champion, someone who is advocating for anti-corruption reform, who says, our reforms are ultimately about minimizing corruption for everyone, right? We don't want anyone to be engaging in corrupt activity, no matter how they would identify, no matter their group or their class, their ethnicity, whatever else, their gender. So, why then does it matter if we're trying to sort of get to a point where everyone is not engaging in corruption, right? And our reforms should be towards that end, right? And instituting transparency and better institutional mechanisms and whatnot. Why should we care about gender? And you've laid out a number of reasons why, right? But sort of specifically responding to that critique of the ultimate purpose of the reforms being to get us to a level playing field across, whoever might be. How do we respond to that particular criticism to show why this is still an important part of that process to get there? I think you've alluded to it, but just kind of wanting to pull that together.
Do you want me to take a first dive?
That'd be great.
There's a couple things that I see. And this is not well formulated, so excuse me for just sort of brainstorming my way through it. But I came to the anti-corruption work thanks to Transparency International, who was looking for gender people to start helping them analyze what was going on. I had no clue how interrelated these two were together. And I'd been working on gender mainstreaming strategies from higher education through NGO work, following social movement activists in Vietnam for 20 some years. And it blew me away to think that my work in the civil society might have actually institutionalized some of these corruption regimes. The envelopes we give to people to have them show up at a training, the kind of things we do to create pro-poor policies and help people subsidize things. Once those international NGOs left the development scene in Vietnam in particular, the local NGOs were left with those systems in place and didn't have another way to operate. So from a very critical lens, the feminized field of international development, mostly women-run NGOs working on inclusive practices, had actually put in place some of the systems that now, as capitalism has taken over and governments are growing and there's a lot of competition for scarce resources, now we're being hardened into clear institutionalized corruption. So I think there's one piece of it that I thought was really important that we explore. That led me to really understand that much of the work around inequality and gender inequality that I looked at, we don't talk about perpetrators, right? We talk about women as victims, as gender systems that they're embedded in, men as well, when we're doing real gender analysis. But the focus often is on women and women's empowerment, right, in development spaces, which is, again, we have to move way beyond that in how we're thinking about empowerment, right, and gender equality. But then my perusal of the corruption literature, we don't talk about corruption, at least in the academic spaces, as nuanced as we do in the gender spaces. We talk about perpetrators and victims, but we don't talk about institutionalized systems where men are brought into these corruption systems. They can't say no because they won't get promoted. They can't get out of it, right? And so we have to understand corruption as a system that is a part of everyday practice, and it's taught from very young. Thus my focus on schooling. How do we get schooled into corruption systems with those, entrance exams to kindergarten at this point in time? And that's a lot, again, mothers' work in most places. As women move into more economic security and development practices, they're not willing to give up their free labor to do this work anymore, right? So they're outsourcing it, which creates much more institutionalized systems. But because they're transparent costs, we don't think about that as corruption. We think about that as fair and open access, but it leaves so many people out. So from my perspective, I can't see myself around taking these two apart and having two separate arenas of study and focus anymore. If we're going to deal with gender inequality as a problem, we have to deal with corruption as a problem, and vice versa. So they're two sides of the same coin, really, right? There's no excuse anymore. We know gender equality. We know how to get there. We know it's the right thing to do. Anyone who's upending the system and making sure we don't have gender equality is part of a corruption system, right? And I think that, to me, that's the piece of it. And the perception of corruption is what's shifting and changing, especially in the past 5 or 6 years, right? People see this through authoritarian governments, through global capital, through climate change, through election systems. They're seeing corruption much more in their everyday lives. And so the perception that it's out there is impacting how people behave. So going back to Zia's case, it's a tragic ending to her story is that during COVID, her son became sick right at the initial parts. She was so afraid to take him to the hospital because she was afraid she couldn't afford the fees, couldn't afford the management stuff. They got there too late, and her son passed away. There was no bribery paid, but it was a perception that the system was so corrupt that she would not be treated equally, that impacted her decision and really has caused great devastation in their life. So again, I don't see how you can dismantle any understanding of corruption and gender in the same breath.
That was great. Thank you, Christy. Roberto, did you want to jump in on it? Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, just to talk about the other side, because I think my experience is the opposite of Christy's, in the sense that I came from anti-corruption and then started working on gender. So I also got to see how the two phenomena interact with one another. And one of the very interesting, I think, pieces of work that we did over the past few years, or right after we published, for example, the Global Corruption Barometer in Latin America, we had the opportunity to work with UN Women in the region. And we also obtained some funding to sit down and interview, for example, women members of parliament across different countries in the region, to understand, what were their struggles, why the anti-corruption agenda was not progressing. And we also noticed that in many countries, and this is what they told us as well, the anti-corruption commissions, for example, in parliament, were mostly delegated to women because they were not really taken that seriously. So all of the commissions that were seen as, let's say, less important, those would be the ones that would be given to women. And at the same time, those commissions that were taken as more seriously because they handle money or they handle important decisions or whatnot, those were given to men. And then even though women were present there, sometimes their family life or whatever would interfere with them being able to join late night meetings, for example, or stuff like this. So that's just to also say that even though the goal of any anti-corruption policy is indeed to make life for everybody better, corruption affects men and women differently, and that is something that we need to take into account when we're designing any sort of policy. And also, I think it is very important to see that I think is also the example, the very tragic example that Christy just mentioned about Vietnam, and this woman who lost her child due to just perceptions of corruption. I think, unfortunately, what we see is also that at the global level, the first thing to go out the window whenever there's a crisis or whenever there's high levels of corruption is expenditure on social services from which women benefit most. So in a way, any sort of, I would argue, any sort of anti-corruption intervention in the health sector, in the school sector, in those services with which women have more contact is a real, I would say, is a great way to work on both the gender side and the corruption side.
Thanks, Roberto. And Christy, I think the two answers really complement one another from those two different angles. So thank you, both of you. I think we probably have time for one or two more questions. I saw Petra raise her hand first and then put it down. So or his. So Petra, if you want to jump in, and then we'll go to Jay to close us out, and then go from there.
Sure. Thanks, Skylar. I actually wanted to respond to your comment about corruption helping everyone. And if you're actually looking just for rhetorical practices, I would encourage you to look at the Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States, because that is literally what we are faced with when we say Black Lives Matter. The response is, but all lives matter. And so that we have a lot of experience making the point that all lives matter when Black lives matter, for example. Or that, focusing on women, focusing on Black people, focusing on police violence against Black bodies, focusing on the different impact of corruption on female bodies. Looking on that is important and essential, in fact. So, thank you.
Yeah, that's such a critical point. And I think it gets to sort of what I was saying earlier. One of the takeaways I had from Christy's presentation was the human element of it, right? And just highlighting the actual costs that everyone is facing, no matter who you are. But as you said, it's highlighting the specific ways in which our different identities or different kind of ways of experiencing the world are affected, right, by those identities. So really good point, Petra. Jay, if I'll I think we could turn to you, and then we can close this out.
Yes, sure, Sky. Thank you. I think I'm just delving deeper on that question from JJ about the so what of things, and just thinking about how programs are designed. And we tend to compartmentalize gender and corruption, and maybe and when we're designing programs, we're going to say, make sure to put gender in there. And so us as Mel will have some disaggregation about gender, and that probably should do, right? But what we're trying to express here is that there are no measurement tools available that integrate these two variables quite neatly. And so I think in this specific area where there's effects that we don't measure from a gender perspective that is affected by corruption, and corruption that affects gender, I think it all pulls into theory of change and the programs that we so far design. Does research provide enough theories for us to use so that we can pull together interventions that actually address this from both angles? And I would say that there's little research done on these theories. And so if those theories are available, if you have been testing or piloting approaches from both angles, that will be useful for the sphere of getting through, this linkages to and fro. The other thing is that, so when we do MEL and there's no theory to back it up, it's either we're testing specific theory, or we're just trying to get through some gender indicators into some measures, trying to figure out how women are affected. And, there's some limitations there. If you don't invite enough women, we wouldn't know, right? If there are no women participating, we wouldn't know either. So if it's not incorporated in the theory of change, it will not be intentionally measured throughout implementation. And the baselines will not occur. Therefore, in the end line, when we evaluate, we won't have any assumptions to bear with and move forward to another programming cycle. So just a thought. I think it tells us a lot about, about how we program intentionally, and maybe some gaps that we can actually fix when we program and design.
Yeah, thanks, Jay, for really highlighting the way in which we can take all of this sort of body of research in this discussion and put it into practice in program design, which is, I think, for many folks on the line, a key takeaway and a necessary takeaway. So I think I'll turn to Christy just to see if you have anything else to add in response to the last couple comments before I share a couple wrap-up remarks, and then I'll turn back to Lamarck.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate the questions and the various comments and going on in the chat. And Jay, your summation is really great. I also wanted to just highlight one thing, at least in my own research, I see women on the front line of prevention of corruption, and because they're the ones on the ground developing the strategies to stay away, to avoid it. Like I've heard teachers talk about how they're given an envelope to do some extra work. They can't give the envelope back because the family won't trust that they're doing their best job. So how do you get around this sticky situation? One strategy they've developed is hold the envelope, do the work, and at the end give the envelope back to the family and say, see, you don't actually have to do this, right, on the ground. And so thinking about the strategies and women as center in the research that also needs to be done, how can those be scalable? How do we kind of counteract corruption on the ground level, I think is also really key to the future work that we need to do. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Christy. And just wanted to note, we had a comment in the chat about really putting the gender corruption nexus into our programmatic documents themselves, and that gets to Jay's point as well. So I just wanted to highlight a couple key takeaways on my side, just kind of observing the presentation and then you know, the Q&A and our discussion here. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I think the most important part of this is really bringing together the human implications of corruption and the gendered experience of corruption, and kind of thinking through how we can highlight those human experiences, understand them, and then incorporate that into our programmatic work, right, and our response, and also our you know, it may not be an actual program, it may not be funds that are allocated, but even just how we think about this issue, how we talk about this issue. You know, Christy, I think you highlighted really well the financial and kind of everyday costs of corruption for women across issues ranging from trade to education to health, and really kind of showing the way in which you know, women experiencing the issue because of their everyday interaction with those different services becomes such a huge part of their experience, and I think that the highlighting of the research on need corruption really fits well with that. You highlighted a range of different solutions through your presentation, you know, better involving women in policy decision-making processes, and really more generally kind of more inclusive policy decision-making processes, strengthening institutional accountability for reciprocity culture, for example, better whistleblowing and transparency, both of government processes and then of the way that corruption is affecting women. I particularly thought the discussion around media coverage, right, and even just the way that we talk about these issues as a collective, right, helping us to understand the different ways that men and women and then as you brought in kind of other identities, the way that we all experience corruption. And then I really appreciated through all of those different solutions, the way that you highlighted the need to use gender analysis to kind of dig in specifically on the ways we could potentially solve those problems, right? To just understand what's actually happening, right? And then what are the potential solutions, what would potentially work in an educational context, for example, or a health context, what are the kinds of tweaks that we need to change? And I think it's pretty clear that without accounting for those gendered assumptions, stereotypes, discrimination, and how they interact with corruption, we're really missing kind of a key way that we can orient our programming, orient our policy work. So thank you again for your comprehensive presentation, and thank you to everyone for chiming in on different bits of this issue. So I think with that, I'll turn back to Lamarck to wrap up our conversation, and we're close to time, so hopefully we'll be able to get out right on time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sky. As we we close today, I would like to first of all, thank all of the participants who have joined us during today's session. I would also like to thank Sky once again for co-moderating today's session, and also all of the presenters who have provided very enriching presentations. Today we were able to hear from Roberto about measuring transnational corruption, which is indeed very challenging. And some of the issues that he addressed includes conceptual ambiguities, missing data and data overload, and limited systematic research. However, he left us with a little bit of hope, knowing that there are some tools such as access to information laws that have been developed to provide assistance in measuring corruption. That was then followed up with Matthias's presentation. He was able to provide us with an overlook of the UN Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, which is the only binding global anti-corruption convention. And particularly, Matthias was able to highlight the review mechanism for the UNCAC and the significant role that civil society plays in the UNCAC review process. And finally, we were able to hear from Christy and her deep dive presentation on gender and corruption, highlighting how women perceive and experience corruption differently, and also the resources that are available to help us address corruption through a gender lens. I think Christy's presentation in particular was a good follow-up from yesterday's session on approaches to assessing and measuring inclusive rights, which in particular where we heard from Danielle, where she presented on gender equality and social inclusion being a framework that seeks to change the structures that have kept people marginalized. And this is particularly important as development programs take on a more people-centered justice approach. And so that was also a good tie-in. We were also able to hear yesterday from the Federal Judicial Center and some of their challenges in developing assessment tools for the Georgian High School of Justice Judicial Training. And so we were able to hear the challenges with that, and we were able to link that to some of the challenges that Roberto and Matthias added in their presentations today. And so as we close, we would be very grateful if all the participants could take about 2 to 3 minutes and complete the Mentimeter survey, which is provided in the chat, as your input is critical for program monitoring and evaluation. Also, we encourage everyone to continue the discussion and exchange of ideas and experiences on the Justice Sector Measurement Discussion Board on the Just Track Plus Knowledge Portal. And with that, I want to thank all of you all once again for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.